Hello, it is 1 p.m. Eastern. I want to welcome you to our webinar, part one of a three-part series. Thank you for attending. I'm seeing the panelists come on in. So we're just gonna start and get rolling on this. Like I said, part one of a three-part series. We have one webinar today and then two on Thursday. And this is going to cover research and use of force. So what we're going to do is we're going to touch on a little bit about us and some acknowledgments, hit on the importance of evidence-based policing as kind of a foundational principle for all of this. And then we're going to look at some of the research literature and see what it can tell us about predicting or being a precursor to a use of force event. We're a year into the pandemic, so this is now I think a standard slide and standard part of any type of meeting now, but the Zoom housekeeping element. Video and microphones are disabled for the vast majority of you. So the only people you're going to be hearing from, myself and Jeremy most likely. That means the only way we can communicate with you all is going to be through chat and through the Q&A. So what we ask is that for any sort of questions that you want to ask us, and you can ask them at any time, use the Q&A function. Nice thing about the Q&A function as well is that you can go into the Q&A and you can actually upvote some questions that you might want to ask, that someone beat you to it or something like that. And that will actually help us potentially prioritize some of the questions depending on how many we have and how much time we have. Please use the chat window, highlight any technical issues, share information, kind of that sort of thing. Like I said, we want to focus on using the Q&A for the questions that we'll address at the end, just because that allows everyone to kind of see them, can upvote them, can do all that type of stuff. And we're recording the event, and we'll be posting this. I imagine also we'll be able to post some of the slides as well if we're able to record this as well. So we should be able to pass all those types of things along. So my name is Sean Goodison. I am Deputy Director and Senior Research Criminologist. I've been at PERF for a little more than 7 years now. Before that, I was a law enforcement analyst, civilian researcher for the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. My PhD is from University of Maryland, College Park. And throughout my 15+ year career doing this type of thing, I've done a lot of independent work with numerous law enforcement agencies, collecting data, doing analysis. I've also worked directly for local, state, and the federal government on various data projects and data issues. I'm going to pass it briefly to my colleague, allow him to introduce himself before I pick it back up.
Thanks, Sean, and thank you to everyone that has joined us today. My name is Jeremy Barnum. I'm a Senior Research Associate at PERF. I've been here for about 4 years now, and prior to that, I earned my bachelor's degree at Michigan State University in criminal justice and my master's degree in criminal justice from Rutgers University. I spent 5 years working on my doctoral degree in criminal justice at Rutgers and previously worked as a project manager at the Rutgers Center on Public Security. Back to you, Sean.
All right, thank you. Now, I want to share some quick but very important acknowledgments regarding our work. This is all part of a larger project that we've done on precursors use of force, and everything has been funded and supported by the Charles Koch Institute. So we're very grateful for their role and their support in all of this. We also want to thank our expert panel. They were especially helpful when looking at the research and the literature on use of force. Our expert panel is Steve Bishop at Dallas PD, Lori Friedel at University of South Florida, Bill Terrell at Arizona State University, and Rob Warden at SUNY Albany. Also want to thank the PERF Research Advisory Board, currently chaired by Ed McGuire at Arizona State University. They provided some very important feedback on a few different versions of the draft report, which is associated with this webinar. And finally, I want to personally thank my research team. Jeremy and I are the ones speaking to you today, but we're certainly not the only ones who were involved in all of this. So I want to give a special webinar shout out to some of the other people involved: Rachel Arietti, Elizabeth Berger, Adam Cass, Adam Kemmerer, Tatiana Lloyd-Dota, and Sierra Sitar. And with that, I want to jump right in and talk about evidence-based policing. From our perspective, evidence-based policing must be a guiding principle for agencies. What this means is using science to inform police decision-making in order to provide the best possible public service. This philosophy is important to establishing a culture that will allow you to collect, analyze, and use data effectively. Evidence-based policing means having science available to provide advice and background to current challenges faced by police executives and practitioners. Science should be a part of executive decisions, along with many other factors, and we list a few here: human intel, experience, community, legal authority. So it doesn't simply mean following the numbers in a deterministic pattern. What you want to do is take scientific research and allow it to have a seat at the table when decisions are being made. And incorporating evidence-based policing is important to demonstrate the value and role of science within an agency. It's going to be very difficult to collect meaningful data, develop useful analyses, unless there's already a culture that's looking towards science to be a part of the decision-making process. And that process should be a systemic process. It should be built in. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So what you just heard for a slide was very high level. What does that actually mean for agencies? Well, first up, scientific study comes in many forms. So evidence-based policing is not solely about experiments and statistics, though both can play a very major role, obviously. But bringing science to policing can also mean using the research literature to inform current practices, or developing a plan when building data and metrics for measurement. So for this webinar, we're going to kind of cover that first half. We're using the research literature to help inform some current practices, to provide the best evidence possible. Our future webinars are going to cover probably a little more of that second half: building, having a plan, building with data, doing analysis. It's important to note that having evidence is not an all or nothing proposition. It's just like a police investigation, really. Some pieces of evidence are going to be stronger than others. You can have evidence pointing in different directions, but you wouldn't charge a suspect unless you at least considered all the available information. So it's the same principle going on through in evidence-based policing as we're talking about it. And it's also important that evidence needs to be usable. Externally, that means literature may need to be deciphered a bit and tailored to agencies' interests. Internally, it means having evidence that helps make a necessary decision about strategy deployment. And again, this webinar is going to focus a little bit more on the external to agency incorporation of evidence-based policing. And this is a pretty well-known diagram. Larry Sherman, a famous policing scholar, and it highlights what evidence-based policing is. The idea is to get to that best evidence, and you have that best evidence guide your policies, your outputs, create outcomes, examine them in-house, and then feed back in, while also on the top you have the literature also feeding into the best evidence. That literature side is what we're going to talk about today. That whole other loop and principle, that's kind of what we're going to talk about in the next two webinars. So it's relatively easy to start incorporating strategy or tactics seen in the literature. And that probably sounds a little flippant, but I say that because the main challenges are really going to be to translate a lot of the research jargon to practical guidance, and really being able to discern, know what what's good research versus bad research, and that can definitely be a challenge. But that's where there are a lot of organizations that can help. PERF can assist with that. IACP has mechanisms to help with that. National Police Foundation is another great source. If you haven't heard of the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing, definitely check them out. They are practitioners who have an interest and a desire and a skill for research and evidence-based policing, that really are kind of sitting in that middle ground between pure research and pure sort of practitioners. The federal government also has some options. We put up one from NIJ, National Institute of Justice, Crime Solutions. UK College of Policing also has a really good tool. I'm going to show you just a quick screenshot of that in a second. And also George Mason University, Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy. They have a full matrix with studies and readable summaries. These are just kind of the big sources that you can tap into to find good research literature and have it interpreted well and kind of discerned well. There are others out there, so this is not meant to be an exclusive list, but it also goes to show you there's a lot of stuff potentially out there. So just to show you, this is what Crime Solutions is going to look like, and it breaks down across a lot of different categories. See, there's one that specifically will group together a lot of the law enforcement stuff. You can search it by programs. It has a good range of usability. This is a capture of the UK College of Policing. What I really like about this one is that it includes very specifically what it costs. So kind of an economic assessment of some of these policies or practices. Just as long as you remember, since it's the UK, you're going to see pounds and not a dollar sign. It should still be really good to go. Very useful. And then this is a matrix that you'd find on George Mason University's site. All of this would be interactive. You can click through it. This is just kind of a freeze frame of it, and it measures things on a few different metrics, and it allows you to search and find evidence for whether it's particular problems or programs or whatnot. You're able to get some of those resources from the literature. So the literature allows you to take the experience of others and bring it to your agency, but that's not necessarily all. You likely will have to tailor something to your efforts. And also, if you set up a program, even if it says it works in the literature, well, you have to see if it's working, right? Maybe you want to get a better idea of what's going on. You want to evaluate it. You want to see if it's worth the money that you're putting out for it. So for that's where you'd shift to the kind of that internal focus and the need for good internal practices regarding data and analysis. So, I kind of highlight those two parts, data and analysis. You can only manage what you measure. So if you're not getting any measurement of something, how are you supposed to make any decisions? How are you supposed to make any changes? How are you supposed to know if those changes are working, right? And then when it comes to good analyses, and we're going to talk, this is going to be the subject of specifically our third webinar, so Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. It's kind of holding things to a higher standard, and you have to have a touch of courage, because sometimes analysis may not give you exactly what you were expecting or what you really wanted to see, but you have to, to some extent, look at that, be able to assess, hey, is this a valid analysis? Is this fairly reflective of what our reality is? And even if it's not great, lean into it and try to say, okay, well, how can we make this better, rather than say, oh, well, I didn't like that, so let's just put it on the shelf and hope it disappears. The goal here is really to make good decisions based on the best available evidence. And, sometimes a decision is going to be consistent with current research, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes some of those other factors like experience and human intel and legal authority, they're going to, they're going to carry the day. And that's how it's supposed to be. And sometimes research may not even have very little to contribute at a time. But the issue is that however you do it, the incorporation of science into decision-making in a systemic process allows for police to provide that best possible public service because they're using all available sources of information when making choices. So that can help determine not just what works, but it can figure out why it works too. And both are important for thinking about future strategy for addressing similar concerns that you may have, in another area of your jurisdiction or at another time. Or even identify things that you really need to change and want to figure out the best way to do it. But as I said, you need to measure before you manage, and research also isn't going to be that silver bullet. It's not, it's not going to be so definitive that it just knocks everything else out. It's part of a mosaic. It's a seat at the table, and I kind of think of it as research in a lot of ways is a home cooked meal. It's not a happy meal. But that said, sometimes there's a place for happy meals. Absolutely. You are, you're on the road, you're just getting, you need something to hold you over until the next meal. Happy meal is perfect. Something that's quick, something that's fast, but you also don't want to live on happy meals. And, of course, there's I think slightly misconstrued belief that research just always takes a long time. Well, some research takes a long time, but especially if you build a more systemic process to incorporate research, it's going to take less time. And sometimes that home cooked meal, which does take a little bit more time than the happy meal that you grab on the road, that doesn't mean every meal is a 3-hour, 15-course banquet. Sometimes that extra time is 25 minutes rather than the 2 minutes for the happy meal. So just thinking about that in terms of food, probably because it's right around lunchtime here Eastern, and that's what's on my mind. But I also think it's a good overlay for research in policing. Funny enough, and I just wanted to highlight one more available source, and it's a primer on evidence-based policing, and it's written specifically for police executives. Published by National Institute of Justice. The author is Dr. Gary Cordner. He's currently serving as the academic director, the education and training section for the Baltimore Police Department. And it's really an excellent source. It covers about 45 topics, and most in less than a single page. I think the first one is about evidence-based policing broadly. That might be 1.5 pages to 2 pages. That legitimately is probably the longest one. The publication itself has a good number of pages because it's filled with extensive resources too. We provide a link to it, obviously here on this slide deck. You can search for it. It's also, a link is included in our report as well, the hard copy report. And this is what it'll look like. Like I said, it's a very good resource and really written with a kind of a police executive in mind. So with that, I am going to pass the baton off to Jeremy Barnum, and he's going to hit some of the topics in the research literature as it pertains to use of force.
All right, sorry, I had a bit of trouble there unmuting my microphone, but I think we're ready to go. So I'd like to talk a little bit today about what the real starting point for this project was, as it is for most studies, and that was a comprehensive review of the use of force literature. So use of force has been a critical issue in policing for a very long time, and so there's a really abundant literature on this topic. Of course, it's taken many twists and turns over the years in focus and method and findings. So what we really wanted to try to do is collect this literature, but try to identify broad areas of consensus across the studies to get an understanding of what factors have been studied in terms of their influence over use of force, and which ones are important or have a meaningful relationship with this outcome. So we began with the universe of use of force literature, and we collected pretty much anything we could find on use of force from major criminology and criminal justice journals. We ended up with almost 400 studies. So that's a lot of studies. So our goal was really to focus in or zero in on studies that focus specifically on factors that influence the likelihood of force in a given encounter or incident, the precursors of force as we call them. So of course, this excludes a lot of studies that look at, for example, prevalence of force across different jurisdictions, trends in force over time. A lot of studies look at legal issues in use of force. And then a lot of studies use force as a predictor, but not an outcome. So a question like, do electronic control weapons result in fewer injuries to officers and subjects? We didn't look at those kinds of studies. When we implemented that criteria, we whittled our studies down to about 30, where use of force was the outcome. There was some sort of comparison in the study, like force versus no force cases. And the studies attempted to control for the influence of other factors. So use of force is an incredibly complex event that unfolds in response to constantly changing circumstances, which is a way of saying that there are potentially many factors that can come into play in terms of whether force occurs or not. So for us, it was really important to zero in on studies that include a broad range of factors, but also use methods and analyses that can control for the impact of each factor relative to one another. This way we can identify not only what factors matter, but what factors matter above and beyond others in terms of whether or not they influence use of force. So after looking at the literature, we were able to discover that most factors generally fall into one of 4 categories pertaining to an encounter that results in force. So you have officers, of course, and officer characteristics, such as officer demographics, their role in assignment, their training history, their disciplinary commendation history, cultural orientations. And then you have the subject, the person who force was used on, characteristics about them, demographics, their sobriety, mental health status, demeanor, whether or not they resisted officers' commands, and if they possessed a weapon. You have situational characteristics, which is just a reference to features of the immediate situation or encounter between the officer and the subject. So this is things like whether the encounter was initiated by the officer, whether it was a reactive encounter, what type of offense initiated the encounter, whether there were bystanders and how were they behaving towards the encounter. And then you have environmental characteristics, and this is features of the larger area, or if you want to think about it as a neighborhood, features of the neighborhood in which the encounter occurred. So you have neighborhood demographics, the crime rate of that neighborhood, and whether that neighborhood experiences concentrated disadvantage. So there's a lot of literature on this topic, and it's kind of complex. And so what we wanted to do is try to organize it in a way that's a little more accessible and kind of easily digested. And so what we did is we created a matrix that lists the 30 studies that we focused on and key components of the research, and that's what's partially displayed here. So when you look at this, you can easily see who conducted the study and the year it was published, where the study was conducted, or the study setting, the city. And then you can see the factors that were studied in each study. And they're grouped into each of those 4 main groups we just talked about. We listed every study that was, or every factor that was included in each study, and then we bolded the factors that achieved statistical significance somewhere in that study. So we didn't state the nature of the relationship, so we didn't say whether factor X increased use of force or decreased use of force, just if there was a meaningful relationship at some point in that study. This is mostly practicality. So a lot of studies, or some studies, included multiple statistical models where a factor might be important in one model, but not another. So we wanted to keep it simple. We wanted this to be a starting point and kind of a big picture view of what has been done in the research and where you might want to look further. So let's start talking about what the research says about different factors within those groupings, starting with officer factors. So overall, officer factors have been shown to be important as a group of factors, but not as important as some of the other groups of factors. A few officer factors have been found to be related to use of force. And there's really two key factors that have shown up with a pretty consistent association with force, and that's officer education and officer experience. And specifically, officers with more years of education and officers with more years of experience are generally found to use less force than their counterparts. There haven't really been many studies that have found factors that have an increased force in terms of the officer. There's some preliminary evidence for two, and it's officers' past uses of force and past use of force complaints. Only studied a few times, but they generally show that use of force may be more likely. Again, we need a lot more research on this. And then there's a lot of factors that simply haven't been studied yet. So we don't know a lot about how shift characteristics influence use of force. We don't know shift length, how many consecutive shifts the officer has worked, whether or not they're on overtime and how many hours of overtime they worked, whether they're working the night or day shift. We don't really know much about those. We don't know much about assignment practices, whether working a permanent beat or a rotating beat has an effect. We don't know if the common practice of assigning younger area officers to high crime areas has an effect. We don't know a lot about other officer activity and characteristics such as past number of stop searches and arrests, and whether higher numbers there influence use of force. We don't know much about commendation history or disciplinary record and how that predicts use of force. And we don't know a lot about health and wellness factors and how those influence use of force, like past number of sick days, prior injuries, or physical fitness status. So compared to officer factors, subject factors as a group tend to be more important, and more subject factors are generally found to be related to use of force. A key one here is subject resistance. When a subject resists an officer's commands, that tends to play a pretty large role in predicting whether an encounter results in use of force. Another important one tends to be whether or not a subject is impaired by drugs or alcohol. If they are, that tends to result in more force. Unfortunately, many studies lump these two variables together, drug and alcohol impairment. But when studies break those apart, there's some evidence to suggest that that relationship is largely driven by drug impairment, not alcohol impairment. And then more force is likely when there's more when officers arrive on scene and the subject is in conflict with another person, on male subjects, during the course of an arrest, and when a subject possesses a weapon. So there are many other subject factors that have been studied in general, but the evidence on most of them is unfortunately mixed or inconclusive. So subject race and age, for example, have been included in just about every study on use of force. And you can find studies that go many different ways. So there are about a third of the studies we looked at show a significant effect, with non-white subjects and younger subjects being more likely to be the recipients of force. But the most common finding is that there's no relationship between these factors and use of force. Mental health status has received some attention in the literature, but again, it's largely divided, with some studies showing an effect, with subjects in mental health crisis more likely to experience force, whereas other studies showing no effect. Interestingly, some factors like subject demeanor, if they have an aggressive demeanor, if they show disrespect towards an officer, lean towards little or no effect on use of force, but they've been included in fewer studies. And then there's other variables that we just don't know a whole lot about yet, such as the subject's warrant status, whether or not the subject is experiencing homelessness, and the subject's gender identity and sexual orientation. These factors have received little or no study in the literature. Situational factors as a group have also received considerable attention by previous researchers and tend to be a pretty important set of factors as a group in terms of their influence over use of force. Perhaps the most evidence we have is on proactive encounters, or those that are initiated by the officer. These tend to be associated with more force. Included in fewer studies, but also showing a positive association, are encounters that involve a pursuit, encounters that involve bystanders that are displaying an aggressive or hostile demeanor, and encounters that involve a warrant check or where the officer called for backup. Other studies, other factors that have been studied but a limited capacity to produce mixed results include how much evidence there is against the subject in terms of how much evidence they've committed a crime. Doesn't really appear to have much of an effect, and the number of subjects doesn't appear to have much of an effect. There is some evidence to link more serious offenses and encounters that incur public with more use of force, but there's a lot of mixed evidence here. And then there's little research on how the content and delivery of information by dispatchers impacts use of force, but this is a really important area for future work. Lastly, we have environmental factors. This is a largely understudied area in general. Very few studies actually incorporate environmental factors into their analysis of use of force. But those that do tend to find that two factors in general are linked with more use of force, and that's crime rates as measured by violent crime rates, usually, and specifically homicide rates, and higher disadvantage, usually measured as an index of poverty, unemployment, and instability. These tend to be linked with more use of force. Fewer studies have included neighborhood demographics, and of the couple that have, they've produced mixed findings. So overall, there's a really good body of research on use of force. It tells us some important things, but it does have important limitations to keep in mind. So many studies rely on limited data sources or have been conducted in just a handful of study settings, primarily with larger agencies. We don't know as much about use of force in smaller and mid-sized agencies. The best studies we have use a method called what's called systematic social observation to collect their data. This is where an observer rides with an officer to code factors as they occur during police encounters with the public. This allows us to capture data on a broader range of factors that may or may not be included in official reports. It also allows us to better consider encounters that didn't result in force and compare them with those that did. A lot of studies rely on administrative data, such as use of force reports, arrest reports, incident reports, so on and so forth. Of course, this limits our study to any factors that data is already collected on, and we might not always collect data on the most important factors. Oftentimes, the richest data is contained in officer narratives, but unfortunately, it's not always a consistent or reliable source of information because you're relying on the officer to report clearly and accurately on different factors. There's also just a general lack of standardization in research, which might explain some of the conflicting findings we see. So particularly this comes down to how we measure or operationalize use of force or what our dependent variable looks like. And across the studies that we looked at, there's kind of a range. Some look at whether or not any force occurred versus no force. Some look at specific types of force relative to one another. Some assess the highest level of force. So that can play a role. Same thing happens with predictors as well, or precursors. And I go back to that example of drug and alcohol impairment where they're lumped together and you find this effect and then you pull them apart and it's really just the drug impairment that seems to drive that relationship, at least based on the studies we have. And then you see a lot of different methods of analysis, a lot of regression models and multi-level models, but there is some indication that the same variable can become significant in one model and be non-significant in another model. So the method of analysis can be a really important determinant of whether or not a factor appears as significant. And then of course, many factors are just understudied or not studied at all. And I think this goes back to a lot of data limitations in general. And that's what we want to try to improve with this work here. All that said, taken together, the research does offer some really helpful insight about the context that lead to use of force and the factors that we can start targeting now to prevent and reduce it. So we think about some of the factors that we just highlighted that are important. Officer education pops up, so that might instruct us to start thinking about our recruitment practices and how we can change those to hire more college-educated officers. That tends to be the variable that's studied there. We might think about revising our pursuit policies to provide clear guidance about when officers can and cannot use force when those situations occur and might reduce overall force. The key is to identify what factors are important, and the literature can help us do that and then craft policy that's directly tailored to addressing those. And you don't have to do everything. You can start somewhere. Agencies might not be able to feasibly address everything at once. But even if you start with one or two variables, you might be able to make a meaningful impact. And at the same time, as we said, there's still a lot we don't know about what factors predict use of force and how. So I gave a very high level overview of these factors in the relationship to use of force, but when you really drill down to them, there's a lot we don't know and a lot of nuance to these relationships. So even if we think about officer education, for example, we haven't really studied the types of education that matter, whether the degree matters, how many years you need. Usually they just study some college or bachelor's degree, whether the quality of education matters, so on and so forth. So there's a lot we still need to learn about factors we know something about, and then a lot of factors we just don't know anything about. And so to improve our policies, programs, and practices around use of force, what we really need is better data, and agencies are really well positioned to lead the way on this front. And that's what this project is about. That's what we hope to be able to help you with in our next two webinars. And with that, I will turn it back over to Sean for some question and answer.
All right, great. Let me just throw up one thing as we have a few questions come in, and we're going to hit them and hit whatever we can in the time available. Actually, let me just toss this up at the moment, just so you can all have our contact information in case we don't get to a question, or to you have additional questions as things come up. Also, I'm going to throw on my video because I feel like I'm the Wizard of Oz and I'm talking behind a screen. So I'm going to get that on. So looking at the questions, first question that has a lot of upvotes, Bob, it's a great question, which is why I guess it got so many upvotes. And it really actually highlights kind of a lot of what happens in research. So the question is, why would officer education experience impact the amount of force an officer uses? Wouldn't assignment be much more important, right? Because officers, the more experience, they may be higher rank, less likely to be on patrol, making arrests, etc. And that absolutely makes sense. And that's part of the challenge with research and what research tries to do. So the studies that we looked at, they take a lot of data, right? They have a lot of data and a lot of different variables. And what they'll do is look and go, you know, education might play a role, experience might play a role, assignment might play a role, all these things that might play a role. And you could create a really convincing set of facts that say, oh, well, this is why this one would be more important. This is why this one would be more important. And it's all rational and logical, and everyone go, yeah, absolutely. Well, what these research studies are trying to do is takes all these variables and puts them in together and tries to effectively rack and stack and see, okay, which ones are going to come out as, you know, really being the most predictive of what our outcome is. And this is actually going to be a topic for our third webinar, a little bit, talking about how you do analysis. But what happened kind of across these studies is we find when you have variables that account for experience and education and unit assignment, and some other factors which you could think make a really convincing case on itself, maybe even gender or something else. We find that those aren't as strong of a relationship, and in fact they're what we end up calling spurious. They appear to be a relationship, and if you just look at it, just look at assignment and force outcomes, you see that there's a correlation, right? But when you take into account some other factors, they start to diminish that correlation, such that the correlation almost doesn't exist once you take into account education and experience. I don't know if Jeremy had anything to add on that, but I thought that was a really great question because it really highlights a lot of the potential value of the research and the research process in kind of coming up with priorities essentially for dealing with use of force.
Yeah, and I'll add that unit assignment unfortunately just hasn't really been included in that many studies, and if it had been, we would be able to kind of assess, what's the impact of education or what's the impact of experience in relation to unit assignment. Do they matter above and beyond the impact of unit assignment? And unfortunately, many studies just haven't included it, so we can't really say if one's more important than the other. We just know that education and experience, education is usually measured by some college or completing a four-year degree, and experience in the number of years, that those things tend to matter above and beyond other officer factors, subject factors, situational factors. Now, there's still a lot we don't know about those. Again, we still don't know a lot about the different nature of education. We don't know if the type of degree matters. We don't know if the type of institution matters. We don't know if the quality of the education matters. We don't really know. We haven't really parsed out hiring in college educated officers versus putting incentives into place for current officers to go back and get their degree. And we also don't really know, one factor we didn't talk too much about is training, but we don't really know if you can substitute education for training either. So that's another kind of open question. Same with experience. I mean, we know more experience tends to be associated with less use of force in general, above and beyond other factors in a use of force encounter. But we don't know if different types of experience officer has had make a difference compared to others. So there's quite a bit to learn here still. I saw another question asked, is both education and experience resulted in less force, or does one have more influence than the other? They're both important. One study by Terrell and colleagues did find that they're both important, and there's no really value to having both. At some point, you're going to be reducing force whether you have either one. So you can be an experienced officer without a college degree and still use less force as less experienced officers with a college degree. So I hope that helps answer your question. I'll pass it back to Sean for another one.
All right, just cycling through, and I think we could probably hit one or two more. We don't want to keep too long past the time, but we do want to try to get to some of these. And of course, any other questions that end up coming up. I mean, what we would like to do is be able to have a bit of a log of this and be able to address these questions. But also, you could email us directly if there are any questions. I just wanted to hit on Nazmia's question, the call for backup and situation factors. Does it matter if it's a one or two person car? And I'll ask Jeremy to jump in a second. But the question of the one versus two person car, I think it's interesting, but it's hasn't really, at least in my perspective, been really robustly studied. And part of the challenge is that a lot of these studies end up taking place with big data, with big jurisdictions. So you're more likely to have these, you're more likely to have a potential for a two-person car setup. So it makes it a challenge to have any potential even comparison group going, which again, that'll be the idea of needing to have a comparison group if you're going to be analyzing your own data is going to be a big topic for our third webinar. But pass it to Jeremy if he has any other thoughts on that one.
Nope, that pretty much answers it. We don't have a whole lot on called for backup other than whether or not that occurred. In terms of one or two person cars, we don't have a lot on that either, although I know it's a common question. What we do have is that we do have some evidence that shows that when there are more officers on scene, force is more likely, and that's just measured as number of officers. So obviously that could be a different kind of variable than one or two person car, as you might have 6 officers on scene or 5, and they all might be coming from different areas. But it's sort of indirectly related, and that's probably the best answer we have on that one.
All right. I think we have time for one more. I just want to scroll to where I saw, because we addressed a few of them already. I want to take the question from Dave. Does research point towards the importance of implementing an early warning system in your agency? Now, we didn't directly, I don't think a lot of these studies necessarily had factors dealing with the early warnings. Maybe a few did. But separate from that, I just want to kind of toss in that early warning systems, the evaluation evidence in my read, and again, I'll pass to Jeremy for his as well, has really kind of been mixed at best. There really isn't definitive kind of lockdown. This is the way it definitely needs to work. There are a lot of different factors, and it becomes its own data challenge, which is kind of why I wanted to bring this question up. Because when you think about early warning, in any sort of system like that, there are so many things to account for, and it becomes a big data question. So you have your officer on patrol, and do you put the flag for the early warning with X number of complaints or negative contacts? Well, what if they're working robbery interdiction? They're going to always get complaints and contacts, but they all end up dismissed. Or are you going to have the same threshold for someone who is working a desk assignment? It ends up being a situation where you have so many different moving pieces. It becomes a challenge to analyze, which again, I think is touching on some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in the next two webinars as well, in which we're taking the ability to collect a comprehensive amount of data and then look at it in a way in which we can actually assess programs, or we can identify kind of the in a particular agency what the top issues are going to be that kind of lead into a use of force incident. So I'll kind of pass it to Jeremy, and then pass it back to me, and I'll send us off.
Yeah, I would say that there's still a lot to learn. I would think that a lot of these factors that we've talked about, if you include many of them as part of a comprehensive data collection effort, that they could constitute an early warning system to identify officers or situations that might become problematic that you can do something about to prevent them from happening. Looking at early warning systems in particular, there's not a ton of reliable evidence on it yet, but there is some suggestions in the use of force literature in particular that early warning systems can be adopted, because we do have some evidence that certain officers may be responsible for the large majority of use of force incidents in general. And that might be a problem, from what the officer is doing in the field, but it also might just be from their assignment. Again, we don't know a whole lot about that. But if we can identify officers who are using more force than their peers, we can intervene and either reassign them to a different area or retrain or what have you. And then the other thing that we didn't really talk about are cultural orientations. So there is some research to suggest that officers that subscribe to a more traditional police culture of, being suspect of citizens and, not really getting along with supervisors and adopting a more crime fighting perspective, those kinds of things tend to use more force than their peers who don't subscribe to a traditional police culture. And there's some suggestions out there in the literature to, implement some kind of measuring system into your agency to track and monitor cultural orientations. So that way, pro-culture officers aren't always assigned together. You can reassign those types of officers with officers who don't subscribe to traditional police culture, and hopefully reduce your use of force.
Thanks, Jeremy. This went by really fast, and there are a lot of good questions here. What we're going to try to do is we're going to try to make sure we can capture some of these and maybe be able to address them in some way. Or if you have a kind of direct question you want to shoot to us, Our email addresses are up above, are also on the site where you probably registered. Thank you all for listening, for submitting some good questions. I hope this was useful. As I said, we have two more webinars coming up. They're both going to be Thursday this week. One is at 1 p.m. That's going to focus on a data framework that we've developed to help agencies collect their individual agencies collect the use of force data. And then also at 3 p.m. Eastern, we're going to focus on kind of analysis and partnerships. What do you do with the data once you have it? So we hope to see you then and be able to address some questions then. And thank you so much. Hope you have a great day, and we'll see you real soon.